Last week's shooting is being blamed on so-called toxic masculinity. What exactly is that? We've asked the question many times, still don't know. Hopefully we'll find out next. Isn't just being blamed on guns, but also on men. Not simply the man who did it or the many men who failed to prevent it, but all men, half the population. Nicholas Cruz was, by all accounts, pretty disturbed, but articles in Refinery 29, USA Today, and something called HuffPo argue that the real root of his violent rampage is something called toxic masculinity. It's not in the DSM. It's a new made-up term, but it's everywhere all of a sudden. The desire to murder others, the theory goes, stems from the masculine desire to control women that for some can only be expressed through violence. Nell Daly is a psychotherapist and hosts Unscripted with Nell Daly, and she joins us tonight. Nell, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker, for having me.
So, I mean, maybe it's not surprising, but I'm drawing kind of the opposite conclusion here. This kid, the murderer, seems like he suffered from a lack of wholesome masculinity. He didn't have a male role model. He wasn't self-sufficient. He wasn't sort of living up to the classical masculine ideal of providing for others, of being a man. He seems quite the opposite of that. So how is this the result of masculinity?
You know, well, let's go back to the idea of what toxic masculinity is. And as I dug through this story to do this segment tonight, I'm still struggling to get my head around the concept, even though I've been familiar with it for a while. It's a very hard and nuanced thing to articulate. And I also want to make it clear that the Refinery 29 article and feminists that are talking about toxic masculinity aren't saying that that's the sole reason why he committed the crimes that he committed. There's several factors obviously involved. Let's talk about what toxic masculinity is and how I understand it. For example, sometimes when I'm on your show, I get death threats, right? Even if it's not a contentious debate, I'll get reposted and I'll get, at times, 3,000 men will come out with sort of violent words on Facebook or accusations towards me that are pretty scary. That's an example of toxic masculinity showing itself, manifesting in our society.
Right.
Also, another example of toxic masculinity, though, is when we shut down boys from actually having feelings. And that's different than the toxic environments or toxic messaging that little boys get through, let's say, certain types of music or video games that they're exposed to on a daily basis. So I just want to make it clear, like, that's what we're talking about when we talk about toxic masculinity.
Is there such a thing as toxic femininity? Can you be too feminine or just too masculine? When I was talking to people about doing this segment today, people were asking me about that. No, and that's because women don't commit these violent crimes at the rate that men do. So since they don't commit much violence at all.
Right. So since like I don't think women are sexually threatening you necessarily after you do the show.
No. But that, because those are classically male ways of acting out in a bad way. But are there female ways? Is there, in other words, I guess we're stipulating that you can be too masculine and you wind up killing people. Can you be too feminine, or is it only boys who are bad when they act as nature created them?
I appreciate what the questions and the line that you're going in. I actually want to get back to the point that you originally brought up, which I think is fascinating. And there was an article published today in the Federalist, which I believe is a conservative blog by a guy named Jason Hansen. And he suggests that exactly what you said at the beginning, could this actually be a result of a lack of healthy masculine role models in our society that causes what he suggests or alludes to is this idea of the revenge of the lost boys. Right. And that goes back to exactly your first point, Tucker.
Well, there's something going on there, and we're doing a whole series on this next month. I don't fully understand it. I don't want to pretend that I do. But there's something about constantly attacking boys for being boys, which is what our society obviously specializes in, that causes them in some cases to embrace this kind of caricature of masculinity, which is violent and grotesquely sexualized. It's a parody of masculinity. And I think maybe that's a response, at least in part, to the attacks on boys for being boys. Do you see what I'm saying? I
do see what you're saying. And I think what's interesting here, and it's really, really sad as a mother, is that we are starting to, there's been so many shootings that we're able, as a psychotherapist and in the psychological community, actually create psychological profiles on data on why these men commit these kinds of crimes. And one of them is domestic violence. A second thing that goes back to what you were just saying is that a lot of them have a lack of a male model figure in their family life. So, it's a very complex issue, and I don't think it's one thing or the other, but just the fact that we're talking about this in 2018 on Fox News tonight and discussing gender and identity and ideas around masculinity shows that as a society, as a country, we're facing a human crisis. And one of the things that's being brought to head is these discussions about what is a new masculine identity or a paradigm shift that's happening in our culture.
Yeah, maybe having a dad at home, maybe pretending that wasn't a big deal was a mistake.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of single moms out there raising kids, and obviously we're starting to see some issues, you know, arising from these things when we don't have
some of us called that, but
models.
whatever. All right, Nell, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.